Hi, it's your Sewing Sherpa Shauna, and we're going to put this facing that has interfacing ironed onto it on the front of the shirt. This facing also has piping, and the piping has been sewn on right up to the circle that we marked onto the facing, and then I left 5/8 of an inch more or less extra so that I can pull this out of the way when I finish my sewing. Okay, so facing, interfacing ironed onto the facing, and piping. I have the front of my pajamas here with that cute little pocket, and I'm going to put these right sides together because we always sew inside out, backwards, and upside down. And I'll take my bowl of pins and I'll put a few pins in. So in the instructions they say matching notches and circles. So in here, about here, there should be, there we go, there's my little notch I put in, and there's the little notch in the facing. So I've matched those two notches up, and then I'm going to be sewing around this corner through all of these. Now I put in 3 pins. You can put in 30 pins to this point. But here's the next part. This next part here that's a little bit confusing is that we've got the collar here, right? This collar, and you're like, what do you do with the collar? You're gonna tip the collar back out like it was going out to the shirt, because we're gonna be sandwiching that raw edge here. So I've got a sandwich, a raw edge sandwich. It's delicious, just kidding. So 1, 2, 3 layers here, 4 layers, 5 layers. We literally have 5 layers here, and that's why they said maybe to make things easier on yourself, sew a couple of those layers together before you get to this point. I did not do that, so I'm not making it easier on myself. So here, this is what's going to be confusing. You're going to be like, but this doesn't lay flat. Like, this is a curve going this way and this is a curve going that way. Happens all the time in sewing. You're going to have to just force this fabric to meet this fabric because we want all 5 layers lined up evenly. And we're going to go all the way up to 5/8 of an inch from the end of the facing. So I want you to stop there, and it should be, that should actually end up with where we notched into the, cut into the neck edge of the shirt. So that's where we stop, and they shouldn't line up. This should be 5/8 of an inch longer than this. The facing should be longer. So that's a good thing if yours worked out like that. All right, so I'm on the facing, hooking the facing to the shirt. I'm gonna start at the very bottom and go up. You can start at the top and go down, but I feel like that it's a little bit more meditative to start at the bottom. So I've got my zipper foot on so that I can bump right up against that piping. So as close as I can to the piping without sewing on the piping. Put my needle in, a couple stitches forward, couple back, and I'm lining all my edges up. Close to the piping, edges lined. All right, I'm at the notch. Ooh, and it feels like this has grown a little bit. I'm gonna let it grow. I'm gonna stretch it a little bit. All the edges lined up. And I'm going around this corner, lining up my corners. And I feel like my corners are not lining up like I want them to, but one thing I can do is I can stop and start at the big top and work my way back down. Finesse it. I can go back and unpick it. Okay, so here I am. I'm at this point where I'm going to go from the piping on the facing to the piping on the collar. And this is where they tell you, it's hard to see this, but they tell you to grab onto this piping and turn it off at a 90-degree angle. So I want this piping to bump right up against the piping of the collar, and it's hard to explain this, but it'll happen by accident. Just Lark taught me how to do this one. So we're still at 5/8. Don't wander off to 1/4 of an inch here. Don't wander off to 3/8. Don't wander off to whatever. You got to stick at 5/8. Look at the edge of your fabric. Look at your seam guide. You're at 5/8. Make sure nothing's bunching up. There's so many layers going on here. 5 full layers going on here. Sewing at 5/8. Coming in for the home stretch. I see my 4 layers here. I'm gonna go right up to the end of those and back tack without sewing on all that shmarm to the left. All right, pulling it out, and let's see how bad I messed up. I can trim this off in a minute. I'll flip it out, and I had to do the last one a couple of times to get this to line up here, but I'll pull this collar out. See right here? This facing lines up to where the collar piping is. That's what I was trying to explain. These two line up together. They bump up against each other. Hi there, back at the sewing table, and we have sandwiched the layers together. Now you'll notice once you flip it out that it's going to be kind of thick and bumpy up in these corners here. So in the instructions it tells you to trim, grade, and clip. So I'm going to show you trim, grade, and clip. Scissors. Actually, these are shears. Actually, they're scissors, but trim. I've got 5 layers here, or however many, and I'm trimming would be cutting all of the layers down to about 1/4 of an inch, right? That part of this seam has been trimmed. The difference between trimming and grading is that when you grade, you'll clip 1 layer, usually the most inside layer, which is on this one the top layer. You'll trim that layer to, say, a heavy 1/8 or 1/4. Then you'll trim the next layer to a little bit outside that layer. And then the next layer you'll trim to just a little bit outside of that layer. So you'll see here, I have got 3 different depths there. So what makes that superior? Which it kind of is. I mean, that's a couture technique and it takes a long time to do that. But it makes it so that when you flip it out, instead of it being like a cliff, like so here, it's like all these layers drop off at the same point. Instead, it gradually drops off. So if you want to practice grading, this is a great time to do that. I personally, it drives me nuts. I'm like not that interested in that. So I'm just going to be trimming to 1/4 of an inch. Trimming, and make sure you don't start trimming till you're 100% happy with that seam, because once you've trimmed it, it's a one-way street, right? You can't go back. I mean, you can always go back, it's sewing, but all right, so I'm gonna get up here to this corner. So at this corner, I can trim to 1/4 of an inch. I'm gonna trim that weird hang off, and then, ooh, I got a little close. But anyways, saying you didn't get that close, the next, what they have you do is clip. So clipping is basically you take like these pie-shaped wedges out. So you can see those like little, like something bit your fabric. That's clipping, and of course you don't want to go past your sew line. You can go up to it, but not past it. But what that does is that removes the bulk in that corner. So now if I flip this out, it's not bulky and it lays really nice. So after I've got all of that done, trimmed or graded and clipped, I'm going to take it over the iron and I'm going to press it. But here's one thing that you're going to notice. So I have got this all sewn up, it's all sandwiched beautifully, but I got this flapper here, this flapper. I'm going to tell you what, leave that flapper. We're going to handle this later. Even though they show you in the instructions that you're going to handle it now, you're going to turn this under and sew it down. I like to wait till my final fitting, because where this attaches to this seam here is very key to how this is going to lay when you're wearing it. So I feel like just save that one to the very last. The other thing in your instructions is it tells you to turn the long raw edge 1/4 and then 1/4 again. And every one of the people who have done this, every one of you has been trying to turn it the side that had the piping. That is not the long raw edge. The long raw edge is this cut edge out here on the facing, because if you'll notice, it's still raw and it's still fraying. So the quickest way to handle that is to send that through your overlock machine. You don't have an overlock machine? Second best, you could send that through with your overcast stitch on your home sewing machine. A really nice finish would be what they said, which is turn it 1/4 of an inch, press it, and then turn it 1/4 of an inch again, and then sew it. But I feel like that's a little bulky, you know, like it's a little bit bulky. So I looked at one of my vintage garments, well, vintage 80s, and their facing, what they did is they turned it under 1/4 of an inch just one time, and then they stitched really close to this folded edge. And that's what I'm going to do with mine, because I have blue thread on the overlock machine and I don't want to fix it all for that. Anyways, I like the single needle tailoring, so I'm just going to press that under 1/4, 3/8. They gave you 1/2 inch to do, or 5/8, so whatever you want. I'm just going to do mine like maybe 1/4 and then sew really close to that folded edge. All right, so I'm going to show you the finishing technique for that front long raw edge. So I'm going to do it like they told you to do it in your instructions, where you fold under once and then again, and then I'm going to show you how I want to do it. So here I folded under one time 1/4 of an inch, and if I don't know how to handle that, I'll take that over to the iron and press it. Okay, I can handle it, so I'm turning it another 1/4 of an inch, so I've got my 2/4 turned right there, both of them. Hopefully this angle will work a little bit better for viewing. So I've got my nice little tights. All right, normal stitch length, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch. Scarce 1/4. All right, and I'm sewing close to that edge, not this edge, right? Set myself up for success. I work about one hand length at a time. Whew. Yeah, so pinning is a good thing. Pressing is a good thing. I tend to avoid it as much as possible, but wasn't always that way when I was starting to sew. Pinning and pressing all the time. I lied. When I started sewing, I was a kid. Kids have no patience for that stuff. And we also don't care what it looks like when it's done. So if you don't care what it looks like it's done and you have no patience, you're probably a kid. You know, I read this thing recently, Sandra Betsina, who, I think she might still be alive, I'm not sure. She said that if you sew 6 hours a week, you're going to be a pro in a year. 6 times 51 is what, 300 hours? Yeah, probably. So put aside a day a week to sew. All right, so that is our big 1/4 inch turned under long edge, and like I said, I still feel like that's bulky, and it was a little bit difficult to do. I mean, not difficult, but not as easy as this is going to be. So here is how I would prefer to do it. So I'm just going to turn it one time 1/4 of an inch or 3/8, doesn't really matter, just be consistent. And this time I'm sewing on that edge, like this edge, not that edge, so the folded edge. And I'm just going to sew real close to it without going off. All right, so if you'll see right here, it's still, yeah, it's still raw on this edge here, but when we get done, this edge is gonna be folded all the way under. You're gonna have buttonholes or buttons here holding this all back in place, and this has all been interfaced, so it's not going to ravel or anything. So I feel like that's a lot less bulky. And that's how I like it. That's how I would do it. If I could redo the other side, I would. We are on to the sleeve. So the sleeve is on page 32. And you'll see right here, they have you doing something called, what do they call it here? Sleeves. In between the front and back notches of the sleeve caps, sew 2 lines of basting stitches parallel to each other just inside the 5/8 inch seam allowance. 2 lines of basting stitches. Basting stitches are what? Come on, you know this. Your longest stitch, right? So I'll show you what they're after, and I'll show you a little workaround for that. But you are done with the hard part. We're home free. We're going setting some sleeves, doing some side seams. You'll love it. So sleeve situation. I have my pattern with my sleeve. There's my front notch, single notch to the front. Back notch has 2 notches. That's the way it's always going to be on every sleeve forever. 1 notch on the front, 2 notches on the back. Sometimes you have a top notch. This one looks like it does, and it doesn't look like I marked it, so I'm going to notch it. Notching it, I'm just doing a little teeny tiny 1/4 inch slit where that notch is at. So I'm going to pull this pin. Now my fabric doesn't have a right side or a wrong side, but once I have marked it, well, it'll be a right side and a wrong side in a minute. Okay, so I have got my single notch there, my top notch there, and my double notch there. I'm gonna sew just inside the seam allowance, which is 5/8. So that means I'll do like 1/2 inch and 3/8, right? Basting stitch, nice long stitch. 1/2 inches here. I am not back tacking. There's 1 row, pull it out, leave myself some string to pull on, and I'm going to do another row just inside that one. I'm using the middle of this foot as a guide. Again, you always want to have some sort of a guide. You can use, you know, but I feel like to make it parallel, make sure I'm not crossing, because these 2 rows should never cross. Oh wait, I just went outside instead of inside. That's what I did. I did that. I need to do 2 rows, 1 at 1/2 and 1 at 3/8, not 1 at 1/2 and 1 at 5/8. But anyways, basting, do you see how easy that was to pull that out? Like, I did that on purpose. All right, I'm gonna do it just outside. That's right, I made a mistake. That never happened before. There. 2 rows side by side. So what these are about is I'm going to take 2 of these strings here on the top. You either choose the top or the bottom. Doesn't matter if you choose top or bottom, but you got to commit once you do it. So I've chose top. When I pull on these 2 strings, I can gather up the fabric. Now I don't actually want to gather the fabric, but I will need to ease it. So this right here, when I pull on this, you'll notice that I'm scooting this along, and what is this doing? It's giving this cap some shape here. So this is kind of puffing out at the top. Guess what else puffs out at the top? My shoulder. So this is how we get a sleeve to take the shape of your shoulder. Something's got to happen to give that some shoulder shape. So that's easing with 2 drawing lines. Now, one of my favorite ways to ease, which you won't find in the book, and sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, depends on the fabric, but my favorite way is to go still a basting stitch, but pretty much on the sew line. So this one's 5/8 of an inch, and I'm gonna start just a little bit before the notch, and I've got 1 finger here behind my foot, and it's holding this fabric real firmly against the foot. And I'm gonna sew, and crimp it up here, let it go, put my finger down again, crimp it up, let it go, finger down. So I'm at 5/8 of an inch almost precisely right now. Of course, this doesn't work in knits or some like Kellner's fabric probably will not respond to this, but most natural fibers will kind of crunch if you squeeze it like that. Now look what happened. I didn't have to pull on anything. Didn't have to do a second row, and I've got that wonderful shape, and it's super even, and it's all the way around the cap. So that's another way to do that. I'm gonna set the sleeve into the arm size. Arm size. I think size means circle, right? Cyclical size, the size, that thing that cuts the grass that, you know, reapers use. Anyhow, size. So I have got a single notch, which means the front, the top notch, which is the shoulder seam, double notch is the back. And so, look at this. I've got that wonderful curve right there, front, back, shoulder seam, that the sleeve needs to be pinned into, and you're like, oh, well, that should be easy, right? Because they have the same shape, right? This has got a curve and that's got a curve. Except one thing, we sew right sides together and inside out. So I'm actually going to be setting this sleeve, awkward, upside down. Now all of a sudden they've got opposite curves. So it's still the same length, it's still the same armhole. We just have to control the fabric. We have to make it do what we want it to do. All right. So I've got my shirt here, right side up. And this is the back of my shirt. This is the front of my shirt. This is my sleeve. This is the front of my sleeve, which means it's got to be on this side. There's my single notch. There's my single notch. That's what notches are for, to help you line things up and figure out what goes to what. I'm going to stick 3 pins in right here. Just kidding. They just attach themselves. They're magnetized. Top notch. And I can't see my back notches on here. And here's the worst part. Somebody took my back pattern and my front pattern home with them. Hello, if you have my pattern, bring it back. So anyways, I'm just going to assume I cut it out correctly. And so it's going to be 1-to-1 here up to my notches. And now my goal is to get this to fit to this. And your sleeve is always going to be slightly larger than the armhole. If it's the opposite way, where your armhole is slightly larger than your sleeve, stop sewing right away, because something's wrong with your pattern, or something's wrong with how you cut it, or you're trying to sew something to something that doesn't need to be going together. Sleeve always the exact same length or slightly bigger. Okay, write that down. So I've got these pinned together, and I don't remember, I think this is the one I eased. Yeah, because it's like perfect. It's so nice. If you can do this ease stitch, it's so nice, because you can just kind of like accordion it in. It just kind of like squishes in. So I've got that pinned right sides together. Now I'm going to come over to my other armhole, and I'm going to use this other one so I can show you how to ease it in. And again, oh, there's my notches. I found them. So on this one, I got to find that top notch. That's my shoulder. And uh-oh, that's my single notch. Oh no, shoot. Just kidding. It doesn't matter, this fabric, I can just flip that curve the other way, right? Because I don't have a right side. And if I had a right side, I would have put this in the right way. Right sides together. When you have fabric that doesn't matter, you just flip it over till your notches line up. Oh, look at that. I actually didn't cut them the exact same length. So that other one's a little janky. Fabric's forgiving. You'll never notice if that was 1/8 of an inch short. And if you do, well, I'm gonna take it up with my mom. Just kidding. Sorry, Mom. All right. Ow! And I usually don't pin, so I'm just doing this for you guys so you can see how I'm torquing it. I'm making these, I'm pulling this around and I'm making it line up, because you can. So right here you'll see this is a lot longer than that armhole. So I grab onto my 2 threads, and again, I'm committing to this side, and I'll pull it until they're the same length. Now, when you are easing into an armhole, you don't want to have any gathers. That means I don't want to sew over anything that looks like a pinch or anything. It's got to be flat. It's got to be not flat, but you know, it's eased, but no gathers, no ridges, no. Hopefully I pulled on the right side over here so it doesn't lock off. All right, so that's easing if you've got threads to pull on. So I'm gonna go and sew these now. All right, I'm over at the sewing machine. I'm gonna set my sleeves. I like to set my sleeves with the sleeve side up, not the shirt side up, because I'm going to probably want to be doing some adjustments to the ease in that sleeve cap as I'm setting it. So I'm setting this over. It's a 5/8 inch seam allowance, regular stitch. I was in basting. I need to bring that back down. Actually, I think that for the first pass they tell you to baste the 2 layers together, and I think they tell you to do that because a lot of people mess up this first part and you're probably going to unpick it, and it's so much easier to unpick the basting than it is to unpick a regular stitch. So do it your way, probably baste it. So right edge lined up with my 5/8 of an inch, both layers of fabric lined up with each other. One's not deeper than the other because it will change how this works if you go deeper. So it's a circle, only it's not completed circle. So think about circles. When you go just even 1/8 of an inch in, it's a totally different measurement. So 5/8 of an inch. This is my crimped side. And it's super easy. Just sewing along, pulling my pins, throwing them over in the bowl. Or if you're gonna have a lot of extra ease, you really want it to be right almost at the top, because think about it, you don't really want a lot of ease like on the side of your arm, right? You want it on the shoulder part. So if you find that it's kind of gathering up anywhere, you would want that right on the top. And I'm sure you have shirts that do have some gathers at the top. Extreme ease, gathered sleeves, they're trending right now. It's a very Little House on the Prairie look. While imagining some idyllic life where we feed ourselves from the fields. Even on Little House on the Prairie, there was Nellie, remember? I'm just kidding. Nellie was fine. All right. Lining the edges up. Lining the notches up. Sewing along. I feel like the filming's a little bit better when it's up on the table, so hopefully you can zoom in. All right, so that sleeve is now set. See? Super easy. You're gonna love this. All right, I'm gonna set the other sleeve. Now the other sleeve has got the gathering stitch, so I may need to do some adjustments to my gathering. So you can fast forward over this or ignore this if you're doing it the crimped style. But you might find this interesting anyways. I don't know. All right, 2 layers lined up. 5/8 of an inch. Basting it if you feel like you're probably gonna unpick it. Regular stitch if you think you got this nailed, right? All right, so here's a little gather here, and I'm gonna scratch that out because I do not want to sew a gather in. I'm just easing it in. I'm not gathering it in. So I just use my fingernail to kind of scrape that out. Now this is way too short. I got way too many gathers in there. I'm gonna slide some of this back off the end. Scratch out the gathers. All right, on the home stretch. tack. So this one, how does this one look? Perfect. No gathers, just eased in, set in 1-to-1. So the next thing they tell you to do is to finish the seam here, which is just, they kind of leave you hanging because you're like, how do I finish that seam? It's so, like, one's all gathered up and one's flat. And easiest way, send it to your overlocker. Just trim it off nice and close and you're done. Zigzag stitch through both layers, that's also viable. So right now, both of these seam allowances, so one of the like kind of haute couture ways of finishing it, not haute couture, but you know, a little bit more elevated. Ooh, I got a little scrunch in there. Is to tip both seam allowances towards the shoulder and then do what we call a flat felled seam, where you're going to wrap the inside seam around the outside seam and sew it down. And gosh, that would be the best way to do it. It would look so nice that way, but I'm going to leave it up to you what you do to finish that edge. So here I have my raw edges, and there is my stitch line at 5/8. So when I put this under here, I want to pick a spot on the foot. So right now, I'm kind of like playing pinball. I've got my seam, my previously sewn seam, going right down the middle of the foot. I find that I get a more accurate, clean finish than trying to follow any kind of guide on the edge, because what I want is I don't want either of my needles to go further past my original seam line, but I do want to trim off the right side so it looks nice. So having that seam go right down the middle of my foot seems to be, get it, a good spot for it. So make sure I'm not cutting into anything else, just these 2 layers. Get to the end, sew off. I'm gonna find my other seam here, shirt sleeve seam, put it under, and putting all my extra threads out to the right. Same spot on the foot. I have got those edges beautifully finished. So now I'm ready to move on. I've got this shirt mostly together, right? All the hard stuff's done. Oh yeah. So I've got to do what? The cuffs. Cuff pieces. Notch here, notch here. That just shows me that it's folded in half. And my cuffs are going to be piped. Cuffs for V and C. Sew piping to the raw edge of each sleeve following the instructions on page 23. So we're going all the way back to page 23 where we first started putting piping on a pocket, right? So to sew your sleeve cuffs, follow the exact same steps from page 27 for adding leg cuffs. So they're going to have us to go page 23 to put the piping on the edge. Piping instructions right here. Yeah, we're not gonna do that. Okay, all right, so remember how we did the pocket? We're gonna do the cuff a lot like the pocket. So you will still need your cuff piece, and the first thing we did is attach the piping to the edge of the pocket, the lower pocket. We're gonna attach the piping to the lower edge of the sleeve, and then we're going to attach the cuff. And remember, on the top pocket they had you press it under a 1/2 inch. We're going to do that right here. Here's my sleeve, here is my piping, here is my zipper foot. I'm going to set my piping, again, pin it into place. I'm watching the edge of my fabric And my piping, I'm not really concerned where my needle is because this is my first pass. It's just kind of, it's like pinning your piping into place, only I'm so pinning it, right? So I'm not really worried 100% about where I'm at on the piping, as long as the edge of my piping is lined up with the edge of my fabric. Get to the end. I don't need a back tack. This is just kind of basting the two together. Trim that off, don't need that anymore. All right, so now I'm gonna take my cuff right here, and I've just pressed under one edge. This edge now has made this the right side of my fabric, and I'm not going to sew this edge to this. I'm gonna sew the raw edge that hasn't been pressed. I'm gonna line it up with the edge, and now this time, this is my real pass. So go ahead and throw that pin in. Nice and tight against the piping, as close as you can get without running over your piping. Got my 3 layers together, lining everything up. This time I'm focusing on where my piping is at and trying to get as close to it as possible. I can't get too close to it because this particular zipper foot doesn't line up so perfectly with the needle, but I'm getting pretty close. All right, so I've got these sewn together. Now the next part is not intuitive, but you're gonna love it. So now I'm going to take my zipper foot off and put my regular foot on. If my geometry is correct, I'm gonna fold these right sides together. So there's my cuff, there's that part that I folded under. I'm gonna straighten that, flatten that back out here. These 2 pieces of piping need to be lined up abso-freaking-lutely precisely. Abso-freaking-lutely precisely. So I'm gonna pin that. That is a absolute. Even if this end doesn't match perfectly, that needs to match, okay? Lining it up with my 5/8 inch seam, back tack, la 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 la. It's magic. It's so much magic. So again, I want my underarm seams to line up perfectly too if I can. And I want these to line up so perfectly that I'm gonna sew them right up to my pin. And guess what just happened? I just bent my pin. But that's how important it is to me. Okay, because I care. And now I'm up to my sleeve allowance seam. I want both of those heading down towards the sleeve, okay? Not in towards the garment. So I've got to go out of my way and make sure that they are tipped in that direction towards the sleeve. 5/8 of an inch. Again, you guys are pinning this, right? Or not. Half-inch seam. I mean, 5/8. Matching my notches, I get to the bottom, I'm back tacking. So this, you'll see, is beautiful. This is turned out, everything looks good, but you're like, floppy cuff, that's not what I want to see. But we're going to do the same thing we did with the pocket, where we fold it in half like this, and then we're going to line it up and sew it all the way around with this. So this edge is folded under, right? We're going to fold this under here, and we're going to pin it, and we're going to sew all the way around just underneath the piping. How cute will that be, right? That was so easy. It was so much easier than trying to stuff this piping into that piping or whatever they were doing. I don't know what that was. That was torture. Okay, but I gotta, before I can do this, I need to address something. I need to address my raw edge here. This needs to get finished. So I'm gonna take it over to my overlock machine, and I'm going to overlock it all the way down from the top to the bottom on both sleeves, and both side seams, before I finish up this cuff, because I'll never be able to get back in there once I finish the cuff. Okay, so we're ready to do the cuffs. What you're gonna wanna do is take that edge that you've pressed under, we've got that turned under, I'm on the inside of the garment, this is my armhole, this is where the piping was. Now I'm gonna turn it back, and I want my seam allowances to go to the front. And I'm going to pin this into place just past the, just barely past this outside seam, like the seam that's going to show, the seam that holds your piping into place. I'm going to fold this so it's just past. In fact, you know what? Line this edge up with the edge of your piping. That'll make it easy because you can kind of feel it, right? You can feel that. So, what's interesting here is I'm pinning it on the inside because that's where all this is happening, but I'm actually going to be sewing on the outside. So I actually probably want to have my pin heads turning the other way so I can reach in and pull them. So I'm going to be sewing on the other side, and it's going to be hard for me to get at these pin heads. So I'm pinning this direction. There's my 1/2 inch fold under. There's my piping. And I'm all the way around. Look how pretty that finishes that all off. I'm going to flip it out. I actually am not going to flip it out. I'm going to have to sew inside this tube. This is going to be easier. I mean, if you have your free arm function, you can flip it out. Remember what your free arm function is. You take that tool tray off. So can you see this here? See this right here? There's my piping. You might want to put your zipper foot back on for this so you can get kind of close. I'm going to see if I can 4x it. I'm on my industrial machine. But I'm just sewing around near the piping. What matters the most right now is that this stitch looks good because this is going to be showing to the world, and if you pinned it correctly, you're catching the fabric under here. And this doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. We got a whole 1/2 inch pressed under, you know, as long as it catches it. All right, I've sewed it around, and I flip it out, and that is pretty, and it was pretty easy. All right, it's time to finish the hem. So here it says at the bottom of the hem, at the hem of the shirt front, fold the facing over so that the right sides are together and sew the facing closed at 1/2 inch seam allowance. So facing that has the interfacing on it, the bottom edge, so we're folding it right sides together. So here's the right side of my facing, the right side of the shirt, folding it right sides together, and then I'm going to sew across here at a 1/2 inch. Okay, 1/2 inch. So my seam allowances are lying flat. I got my right edge lined up with 1/2 inch. I'm going to go all the way out to that finished edge, 1/2 inch, back tack. So I've sewn it right sides together, as usual, inside out, backwards, and upside down. But what happens when I flip it out? Ooh, pretty. But it's also pretty bulky in here. So what they have you do is they have you, of course, clip that corner at an angle to get rid of that bulk, but don't cut past your seam. I also like to kind of get rid of some of this facing seam allowance, kind of get rid of that bulk too, but anyways, that's just me. I'm gonna do that to the other side because you need to do both sides in order to do the hem in one pass. So I'm gonna do this to the other side, right sides together, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch. gone. All right, now I need to push this corner out. These scissors are too sharp. They will totally poke a hole. Pocahontas, Pocahontas. Got that? That's sharp. That looks good. Again, press at any point along the way if you want to. I'm more of a fan of giving one big press at the end because I feel like the more you press, the older the garment looks. Like it just kind of wears it out. So there we go. Looks good. So now we're going to hem across. So I'm looking at this side, and what they're going to have you do, which is the inside, of course. Let's see, what do they have you do? They have you right here, fold the remaining hem up 1/4 inch twice and top stitch. It's a 1/4 inch roll hem. That's why you got a 1/2 inch in here, because they're expecting that you're actually going to be able to roll it at 1/4 inch out here. So I'm going to start rolling it out here, and awkward. You might want to press that or something. But you can start all the way at the beginning here, or you can start right here where the 1/4 inch roll actually starts. Either way is, like, I've seen some done backs, I've seen some forward. I think for this one I'm going to start kind of close to the end of the facing. And then again, press this if that's your thing, and look at all this schmarm just hanging off that I have to deal with. It might actually be, oh yeah, you got to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to overlock that bottom edge to clean finish it and also give me a place to roll from. All right, I've overlocked the edge, and you're like, what does that mean, give you a place to roll from? Well, the overlock stitch is about 1/4 inch wide, so if I fold it right at the edge of my overlock stitch, then it gives me a clean spot to roll from. So again, I'm going to start here, and this first part's the hardest. Well, I guess it depends on who you are, but I'm sewing close to that fold, not that fold, the inside fold, right? This is one of those where you fold and sew. So I'm using my overlock stitch for my first turn, and then the edge of it to kind of help me hold it in place for the second roll. The overlock stitches are just real handy in all sorts of situations. Side seams here are pressed to the front. Always side seams go to the front unless otherwise noted. I'll have to say that the shoulder seams on this one got me, because shoulder seams should go to the front, and on theirs they were like press it to the back. And then after we set the collar, I realized why they had you set it to the back. So that definitely was like, oops, yeah. Go all the way across the hem, and there's nothing else interesting coming up. I'm just doing this, so go ahead and turn this off and go do your hem. Go press something. Tucking this underneath here behind the facing is a little bit challenging. You might want to press that or pin it or something. Now I'm going to try and finesse it and ask it politely to do what I want it to do. And it has agreed. All right, sweet. Thank you. So, wow, all right. And roll hemmed, Tiger Hidden Dragon on the last. Look at this right here. What is that? For a secure finish, top stitch around the entire perimeter of the collar and lapel 1/8 inch from the seam edge for a secure finish. Who knew we needed security in pajamas, right? Okay, I'm gonna do it. So I've got this all pressed out. It looks beautiful. Just kidding, I haven't pressed it even once, but I know how to kind of handle it so that when I press it later, it won't get in the way. So this is what they're talking about. Secure stitching it so that all your layers are laying nice together and it looks tight and nothing's gonna flip out. And I mean, it's a nice touch. It's a nice touch. Is it absolutely mandatory? You come this far, baby, right? So it's kind of pushing my fabric along, which I'm not happy about. It's pushing a little bit out. So I'm gonna stop and readjust my fabric and ask it to stop that. We stop that. I don't know. Sometimes reducing your presser foot pressure, like I've got this knob here I can turn, that will keep the presser foot from pushing so much forward. Sometimes you have to pin it and then like lift and push it back, lift and push it back. Okay, we're at a curve here. Woo! Nice and slow. You might want to reduce your stitch length if you need to. All right, I get here, I'm going to go just past the piping on the collar, and then with my needle in, pivot, and now I'm going around the collar. This is one of those ones where I'm going to do it from the right side of the fabric. I'm not going to do it from the inside. I'm going to do it from the outside because this is one of those that's going to show to the world. Oh, I could have done a better job with my piping there. But all of a sudden, when I'm on the collar, I'm on the wrong side. Uh-oh, because this is going to flip out. So if you want to, you might want to back tack there or something and then start the collar again so that you know for sure it looks really good on the outside. There, turning the corner, setting myself up for success. Sewn all the way around, looks really tight. All right, almost finished pajamas, right? So loving this. I'm surprised at how fitted it is under the armhole, like a real shirt. Like I kind of would like it a little bit lower for pajamas. So, and it's also kind of lean around too. So if you like baggy pajamas, these are not those. I might do my next one a size up or lose some weight. Just kidding. So the thing here that I'm looking at, also my pockets, look at that. I think like what that I think maybe a little bit higher. That's not really covering what I wanted it to cover, but it'll work. So, but if you notice something here, what's wrong? What is going on here? That's my facings. We haven't put those in place yet, so we need to handle that. So basically what we're gonna do here is I've got this little flap-a-doodle and I am going to fold it under and I'm going to attach it to my shoulder seam. And I've got a little schmarm here left from the collar catastrophe that I want to cover up. So I'm going to go just a little bit past that before I turn this under. And I am going to literally whip stitch by hand this onto the shoulder seam so that it doesn't show on the outside. Whip stitch, what is that? Well, it's just like that stitch you whip around the edge. I have laid out my shirt here, the lapel, oh, that's so nice, sounds like I'm talking French. I'm tired. and this part of the collar laying flat. I don't care what's going on out here. I only care about this laying flat, just this little area here. Then I folded this under so that it covers up all of my schmarm. So this part's maybe folded under 1/4 of an inch. This side's folded under like 1/2 an inch, maybe even a little bit deeper. It doesn't matter. The point is we want this to look good. So I've loaded up a needle, a sharp needle, with with a double thread, basically pulled through and then both layers tied up together. Hopefully you can see this. There's my knot. I'm gonna put my knot underneath here, up towards the shoulder. I'm hitting that, and I did choose this brighter color on purpose. I highly recommend you match. So I'm going to catch the shoulder seam here, but I'm not going to go on to the outside of the, oh, I went on the outside. I just want to be going through the seam allowance here. I don't want this to show on the outside at all. I'm just sewing through the seam. Oh, my thread went over to that side instead of the top. There. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to whip stitch this to the seam allowance. It is seriously that easy. You can have them as tight, ooh, that was an ugly one, as tight together as you want, or as loose together, as loose as you want. But the idea is we're just kind of catching this. Now there's a way you can go in and sew this facing with your machine to that seam allowance, and if you're so driven to do that, I don't think it's superior to this whip stitching, because I find it's really hard to get your foot in there and get things lined up properly, and then you end up like torquing the facing, and it ends up causing it to fit funny. At least that's been my experience. I mean, if I were doing 100 of these at a time, like for a factory, I would definitely be doing it by machine. But we're talking like just one shirt, one person, 2 shoulders, one of your last like little processes. So I'm done here, and now I'm going to send this needle back through the seam allowance and trim it off here so I don't have a tail hanging. So that's just kind of whip stitched up there, and it's going to handle that. You don't see it at all on the outside. Gonna do that to the other seam now.